I met Michael on the platform before the train even slowed down. He smelled of the sea, diesel, and wind from faraway latitudes. His suitcase beat against his leg, and his smile was like a faded ribbon hung on a mast after a storm. "I'm home," he said, and kissed my forehead. That night I dried his jacket, listened to the water gurgling in the pipes, and caught a strange rhythm in his breathing, like waves breaking on the shore, retreating, returning. He laughed, but quickly got tired, and stood in the bathroom for a long time, leaning his hands on the sink. He must have been overexcited on the flight, I reassured him, and covered him with a blanket. In the morning Michael said that the coffee was as bitter as rust, and that the rings on his fingers seemed to have become tighter. I kissed his palms, saw the blue shadows under his skin, and noticed his swollen ankles. We had plans, a small repair in the kitchen, a Sunday trip to the lake, but the plans lacked air. Michael waved them away, got irritated, laughed through his cough, and I followed him like a shadow, already afraid to say out loud what I didn't know yet but felt with every cell in my body. Those wounds crumbled like shells, sharp edges cutting into memory, and I squeezed his hand tighter. I made an appointment with the family doctor, although Michael joked that real sea wolves don't get sick, they just get repaired at the dock. We sat in line, listening to other people's coughs, children's cries, and the clock ticking by the door of the office. The doctor looked at the tests, frowned, and asked for a repeat. The blood was taken again, alcohol wipes and traces of cotton wool remained on the table. "Are you drinking enough water? Have you been poisoned? Back pain?" The questions fell like rain on a metal roof. Michael answered, and each answer sounded like an excuse. On the way home, he was silent, and in the evening he fell asleep on the couch, not waiting for the movie. I touched his shoulder and heard an invisible motor working in his body, losing its rhythm. The next day, his face turned pale, his breath smelled like coins. There was little urine, as if the body was saving on light. We went to the laboratory again, and for the first time I was truly scared. Fear stood behind, watching from the window, not looking away. When the phone rang in the evening, the nurse asked me to come tomorrow morning, without delay, and get all the preliminary results. I hung up the phone, stroked his hair and felt how cold my fingers were in the room. Winter had come early. In the morning, we arrived earlier than anyone else. The office, like an aquarium, glowed with cold light. The doctor placed a piece of paper in front of us and said calmly, "Creatinine is very high. The readings indicate serious kidney failure." The words sank into me like stones. Michael nodded as if he had heard the weather forecast, but his fingers trembled like masts on a windy night. We were sent to the hospital, quickly, without pauses between comas. The ward greeted me with the smell of antiseptic and footsteps that taught me to walk more quietly. He was given a temporary catheter, the risks were explained, and a machine was shown that cleaned the blood of what the kidneys should be doing. "This is like a port in a storm," Michael whispered, "Hold my hand." I held it. The screen flashed with numbers. There was a lot of time and not enough at the same time. The nurse talked about the options: dialysis at home, at a center, preparing a fistula, waiting on the transplant list. Each option sounded like a new sea to explore overnight. When the procedure was over, he was exhausted and silent, and I packed his things as carefully as if they might crumble with any extra breath. I signed the papers, counted the hours until dawn, learned to say new words and not cry out loud so as not to upset his fragile peace. "Today." The surgeon drew a line on his left arm with a marker, explaining how the artery would be connected to the vein so that the blood would flow faster, stronger, and the machine could pull it in and out like the tide. "Arteriovenous fistula," I repeated, trying to remember the name of the ship. Michael joked about the new compass on his wrist, but his eyes betrayed fatigue and fear. The surgery went quickly. We were returning home with bandages that smelled like a hospital. I put my ear to his hand, searching for a hum, like a shell that holds the sea. Days passed, we waited, touched carefully, counted the pulsations. But the fistula didn't work. That's what the doctor said. It didn't mature, it didn't open properly, the walls didn't want to sing in unison. These words fell between us like broken dishes. Michael clenched his fist, looked out the window where the river flowed, and was silent. "We'll try on the other hand," they explained to us. I nodded, as if that was what was needed, but at night I counted the seconds by the light of the lantern that slid along the wall, and asked for silence so as not to frighten his breathing. When he fell asleep, I placed my hand over the bandage, dreaming of hearing the warm hum of life, but there was only silence, like after a storm without wind. And darkness. The next operation was on the right hand, and we already knew the sequence: signature, cold room, warm eyes of the nurse, blinding light. This time the hum appeared. He was quiet but stubborn, like a boat engine somewhere behind the fog. It's working, we were told, and for the first time in many weeks I breathed out without fear. When they started to prick me with needles, Michael gritted his teeth, and I learned to be a rock by his shoulder, strong and silent. After the procedures, his hands throbbed, beating like a heart, and he laughed through the curve of his face. "Do you hear how I have 2 metronomes?" I nodded, but when I hugged him, these metronomes interfered. It hurt him, and I was afraid to hurt him. Hemodialysis grew into a calendar. 3 times a week, hours, drips, tubes, conversations about the weather that saved me from silence. Michael lost weight, became nervous, lost his sense of humor. "What am I for now?" he whispered when the window darkened before our thoughts. I answered about the time we still have, about coffee at dawn, about our friends who will never disappear, and about the love that doesn't let go even when the shores give way. I held on to it like a lighthouse. The days became like knots on a rope holding a boat to the shore. Monday, Wednesday, Friday were our new coordinates. Michael had lost the meaning of life, he said, and I didn't argue, because you can't shout the truth. I just brought warm socks, apples, a playlist of his favorite songs, and we listened to them on the way to the center, as if that music knew how to expand the chest. He looked at the floor, and I told him little things: how the neighbor's cat learned to open the door, how the basil on the windowsill bloomed, how she baked bread and ruined the first loaf. I suggested a therapist. Michael shrugged. "It always passes after flights," he replied. But after this flight, nothing passed. When friends came over, he held on, but as soon as the door closed, he crumbled into silence. I learned to cook light meals, count liquids, and put away salty foods. In the evenings, I massaged his shoulders to relieve some of the burden. And when he fell asleep, I whispered into the back of his head like a prayer: "We will make it, my captain, we are together." On the bedside table was a note: "Everything you have lost will come back in a different way." I wrote it anew every day so that the ink wouldn't fade from our fear. And slowly, but it would come back. Over time, the fistula became louder, and I got used to hearing it before I heard his footsteps. Sometimes the skin would turn red, sometimes the blood pressure would jump, and we would be brought home later than promised. Michael was irritated by his own fatigue, and I by my own helplessness. His hands are beating like a heart, and he can't hug his wife, I thought one evening as we stood in the kitchen, each on our own side of the table. He touched me with his elbow, carefully, as if I were made of thin glass. Hugging became an art with many rules: where not to press, how to place my palm, when to let go so it wouldn't hurt. I learned to hug him with my eyes, my voice, the smell of cinnamon in my morning oatmeal. We hung a map of the world on the wall with the planned route of our next journey, although now our journeys were measured along the corridors of the hospital. Michael tried to joke, but the jokes broke in half. Then I spoke for 2, and my language became a bridge that we crossed the night. When I got scared, I asked him to describe the sea, and he remembered quiet bays, signal lights, how seagulls cry at dawn, and we both breathed more evenly. Then the fear took a step back, leaving us space. Together. We were put on the transplant waiting list. These words sounded like a promise and a reprieve. We collected information, underwent assessments, vaccines, EKGs, asked about every little thing in our lives, as if we had to map Michael's inner sea. The doctor explained compatibility, donors, calls in the middle of the night. I started sleeping with my phone under my pillow, and every tremor turned into a beacon. At the center, we met other people with the same dark bags under their eyes. They shared advice: take a blanket, don't forget a book, take care of your veins, joke when you can. Michael listened and nodded, but kept quiet about the main thing. At home, we laid out the pills like sea signals. I stuck stickers on the calendar so that we wouldn't confuse the days. We learned to live between procedures, like between waves, seize warm moments, go to the park, take pictures of the sky, call friends, laugh even crookedly, but laugh all the same. And every night I repeated in my mind, somewhere there is a person who brings morning closer for us. It was a prayer and gratitude in advance so that our world would not shrink to the diameter of a needle. While waiting, we learned not to stop loving, to water the basil, change the bed, listen to each other more than usual, and not be afraid of silence. Once during dialysis, his blood pressure dropped sharply. The screen beeped, the nurses came running, I felt the floor floating, although I was sitting still. Michael turned white, his eyes widened, his hands twitched, and the whole world narrowed to the numbers jumping in the corner of the monitor. Breathe, they told me, and I obediently inhaled with him. The doctor came running to us, changed the speed, gave me a solution, joked about stubborn blood vessels to relieve the crackling in the air. Slowly the color returned, the sound became softer, and I recognized my husband again. On the way home we were silent, but in the car I softly sang a song he loved, and it was our prayer on wheels. At home he stood by the window for a long time, looking at the lanterns and saying that at night the city breathes with him. That evening I made ginger tea, read him a few pages about sailors out loud, and we fell asleep late, holding on to the edge of the blanket with our fingers like a bulwark. The crisis receded, but it reminded me that we were living in shallow water between two storms. I promised myself to learn how to endure the sea, not to drop anchor in panic, to wait for dawn. And even in the darkness to see the imaginary shores of hope. For us, we learned to appreciate small victories. If he ate dinner without feeling sick, it was a holiday. If he walked a block to the park, it was a journey. We planted dill in boxes and laughed at the crooked lines, wrote lists of dreams and didn't cross any out. Michael began to write down memories of his flights, short notes on scraps of paper that smelled of coffee. I asked if I could read them. He was embarrassed, but nodded, and in those lines was a sea that even illness hadn't clipped its wings. In the center, we already knew everyone by name. I baked cookies and brought them in a box, because someone had to say, thank you, to the world. Sometimes we argued. He wanted to go back to work, I was afraid of every risk. We learned to stop arguments with hugs, even if they hurt. You are my course, he would say. And you are my shore, I would answer. In such moments, fear receded. And when the phone sometimes rang at night, we already knew how to breathe slowly, to wait, to listen, to thank, even if it was just spam. Our language became economical and precise, like a ship's log, fewer unnecessary exclamations, more coordinates, more truth, more love every day. And more courage than yesterday. For us. A tiredness like a wet raincoat set in. The doctor explained the anemia and gave me injections to give at home. I was less afraid of needles than the silence between us, so I learned quickly, a sterile napkin, a syringe, a breath, a second injection. Michael joked that I had become his ship's nurse, and I replied that everyone on our ship worked double shifts. After the injections, he slept soundly, but his dreams were as heavy as anchors. Sometimes he would wake up to the noise of his own fistula, and I would touch his shoulder to turn him back to shore. I kept a notebook, blood pressure, weight, mood, small notes. I needed witnesses that we were making progress, even if it was slowly. When I regained strength, we would go to the market, touch peaches, smell dill, and listen to the vendors shouting more cheerfully than the weather forecast. And I saw the fireflies flickering in his eyes again, and I thought, if they didn't go out, then we were on the right course. Every evening we wrote one sentence of gratitude, for the tea, for the rain, for the laughter of passers-by, for the hand that held us. Little things became our sky lanterns. They rose above fear and lit the way home. To our shared home. Again. Papers became another sea. Certificates, bills, applications for help, calls to the insurance company, endless waits on the line with music that got stuck in his ears. Michael tried to hold on, but every number reminded him that he was not on a flight, not on the deck, but in bed, where the clock was louder than the engine. Friends helped, brought groceries, transferred money, offered part-time jobs that he couldn't take yet. I learned to say yes to help and no to shame. Patience ceased to be a virtue, it became a discipline. Every day I chose it again, when we were late for the bus for the third time, when my appetite disappeared, when I caught his gaze in the mirror and saw in it the man I loved, not a diagnosis. We wrote letters to the captain's team, and he replied inspiringly, "The crew is waiting, but you keep the course." Michael smiled out of the corner of his mouth. And I felt a silence growing inside me in which you can live, work, love without losing yourself. In this silence, I heard the answers before I asked the questions: breathe, thank you, love, repeat. And stay the course, even when the cards got wet. Because our home is stronger than the waves and the night. And then fatigue. Together. One morning the fistula became quieter than usual. I pressed my ear to it and was frightened by the silence, which did not resemble peace. The center confirmed, a blood clot, we need to see a surgeon immediately. We ran through the corridors, which smelled of metal and soap. The surgeon worked quickly, yesterday's lines were repeated, but the master's hands held our fears more confidently. Michael joked about the technical inspection, and I held this joke like a talisman. After the intervention, the hum returned, at first cautious, then stronger. I cried in the taxi, he joked further, and we were both right in our ways of surviving. That evening, I took an old album out of the closet and pasted a photo of our first trip to the ocean. We stood barefoot in the water, holding hands without rules or restrictions. "Do you remember?" I asked. "I remember," he answered, and this word became a bridge over which our strength returned. When he fell asleep, I sat by the bed for a long time and listened not only to the hum of the fistula, but also to his even breathing. And I realized, we know how to start over, even when it seems like there are no more shores. Our water found a channel, and we swam further, holding on to the light. The light that does not disappear. Together forward. Together. Warm May peeped through the window, and we risked going to the lake between procedures. The road was short, but it felt like we had crossed a border. We sat on the pier, our feet dangling over the water, and the wind carried the smells of pine trees and motor gasoline. Michael held the fishing rod, but he was not so much catching fish as memories. "Once I could stand here until dawn," he said. "You can still," I replied, and a whole chorus of our future mornings joined in. The sun slid across the water, and I suddenly realized, happiness does not disappear, it simply changes form. Now happiness was in his smile as the waves lapped our ankles, in the fact that we had arrived without being scared. On the way back, we bought ice cream, and Michael ate his slowly, as if he had time. And in the evening I filled out the calendar and mentally wrote another entry next to it: life goes on. He saw my gaze and nodded, as if he had signed the captain's order. We both like to follow this order every day: clean the cups, air the room, call my mother, laugh at stupid things, and not hide our dreams in dark drawers. We learn to be alive without guarantees and checks of happiness. Just be there. Always. At 2 a.m. the phone rang. The voice was clear, without unnecessary signs: possible kidney for Michael. Come immediately. We gathered in 10 minutes, the road was lit by empty intersections. They met us quickly in the waiting room, took tests, glued bracelets. My heart was beating so hard that I could hear it in my teeth. We waited in a room with a silent TV, where other people's lips silently pronounced the news. Doctors came and went, looked at papers, poked at the monitor. Then one sat down opposite and said slowly, "The organ didn't fit. The risk is too high." The walls receded. I nodded, Michael nodded, we both kept our faces straight, like officers in formation. It was only on the way home that I saw a shadow waver in his profile. We stopped on the side of the road, and I put my head on his shoulder, hugging him carefully, according to the rules we already knew. "It's okay, Captain," I whispered, "we'll wait for our wind." And we drove on, slower, but not back. At home, I made tea and we silently watched the steam rising without fear. It taught us a simple thing: to rise again. Even when it seems that the wings are wet and the sky is too low. We will survive this. Definitely together. Summer was slowly creeping into our city, and we were still living between procedures and calls that could change our fate. Michael looked exhausted, his cheeks were sunken, his hands were covered in bruises from the needles, and even his laughter had become shorter, as if he were afraid of tiring his lungs. But at the same time, he began to talk to me more about the future. I want to see the ocean again, he would say, not as a passenger, but as the captain of my own morning. We wrote a list of wishes, from the simple ones, going to a baseball game, to the big ones, a trip to New England. I could see how this list warmed him more than a blanket. At the center, we met a woman who had already had a transplant. She smiled broadly and talked about her new life as if she had opened a window at dawn. Michael listened carefully, and I felt a small light ignite in him. In the evening, he put his hand on my knee and whispered, "If this happens, I will hug you so that no fistula will interfere." His words were fragile and strong at the same time. I hid them in my heart, like a letter in a bottle, and promised to protect them until the wave brought us a real miracle. Because I believed, it was already on its way. Autumn brought rains with it, and every trip to the center became like swimming in fog. Michael was silent more and more often, listening to the drops hitting the roof of the car, and in his silence I could hear fatigue. But when we returned home, he always took my hand, as if to remind me, he was still here, next to me. The doctors said that we had to wait, because the queue was long, because compatibility is like a complicated map with 1,000 coordinates. I sometimes thought that our house had become a lighthouse that shines in the darkness every night, announcing, "We don't give up." One evening, I laid out old travel photos, and Michael held a photo of the ocean in his hands for a long time. "Do you remember how happy we were then?" he asked. "We are still happy now," I answered, "because we are together." And in these words I really felt the truth. Happiness is not in circumstances, but in the fact that we hold on to each other, even when the wave covers our heads. Winter caught us by surprise. The snow fell heavily, and the days became shorter. Michael often froze, and I wrapped him in blankets, made tea, and put a heating pad at his feet. His hands beat with the pulse of the fistula, and he sometimes laughed, "I have two hearts now." But at night, when the pain became stronger, he moaned quietly, and I didn't know how to help. I learned to be there even when I couldn't do anything. We watched movies, listened to music, and he started telling me stories from his flights that I had never heard before, how he saw dolphins at dawn, how he once saved a seagull with a broken wing. There was a sea in his words, and I felt that it still lived in him, not letting me give up. I pressed myself against his shoulder and whispered, "We will wait." "I know." And this faith kept us both warmer than any blanket. At the center, we met new people. Some had just started dialysis, some had been waiting for a transplant for years. And in their eyes I saw a reflection of our fear. But we also saw those who, after the transplant, came only to take tests. They looked different, there was more confidence in their steps, more strength in their voices. Michael once whispered, "I will be like that too." And I knew that he really could. We started writing more in our gratitude journal. Every night we wrote down 3 things, what we were grateful for today. For the hot soup, for the laughter on the phone, for the snow that fell quietly, like a prayer. It helped us stay afloat. One day Michael gave me a small pendant in the shape of an anchor. "To remember, you hold me," he said. I pressed it to my heart and realized that we were both our anchors, not letting us drown in the waves of fear. And that was our greatest strength. The phone rang unexpectedly. The voice on the other end said, "There's a kidney. You need to come now." We looked at each other, and time seemed to stand still. I helped Michael get dressed, we picked up the prepared bag, and drove off in the darkness. The road was empty, and every streetlight seemed to us a sign of hope. Everything in the hospital happened quickly, tests, signing documents, preparing for surgery. Michael held my hand and kept saying, "Everything will be okay." His eyes were shining, albeit tiredly. I tried to remember every feature of his face, every movement. Before he was wheeled into the operating room, he whispered, "When I wake up, I'll hug you like I promised. I stood in the hallway and prayed for this moment to come. The hours dragged on like an eternity. I looked at the door behind which the fight for his new life was going on, and I kept saying in my heart, we'll wait for the dawn. Together. The operation lasted a long time. Every minute was harder than the last. I walked down the corridor, drank cold coffee, looked at my watch. When the doctor finally came out, I held my breath. The operation was successful. The kidney is working, he said. I could not hold back my tears and cried with joy for the first time in a long time. Michael was brought into the ward. He was weak but alive. I sat next to him, took his hand and whispered, "My captain, we won." He opened his eyes, smiled and said barely audibly, "I am here." Those words became the most precious to me. I touched his hair and for the first time in a long time I allowed myself to believe, we have a future. We have already seen this shore, and now we know that we can reach any. The days after the operation were difficult. The medications, the pain, the control of every drop of water, every movement. But along with the pain came hope. Michael was learning to walk again, slowly, a few steps at a time. I held his hand, and we laughed even when he fell into a chair from exhaustion. He began to taste food again, said that an apple smelled like when he was a child. We made plans again, to go to the movies, to meet friends, to go to the sea. And every small victory was a celebration. I saw the light return to his eyes, and I knew, this was our new beginning. We had lived through so many dark days that now even the smallest ray was a gift. And we cherished it as the most precious thing. A month later, we went far from home for the first time, to the park. Michael walked slowly but surely, and each of his steps was a victory over everything we had experienced. He took a deep breath and said, "I feel alive again." I looked at him and thought that it was a miracle to see the person you love return from the darkness. We sat on the bench, and he hugged me, for real, without pain, without fear. I leaned against his chest and heard only one heart. And then I realized, we could be ourselves again. We laughed, cried, held hands, and the world around us seemed new, fresh, like after the rain. We began to live in a new way. Without dialysis, without constant fear. Instead of hospital walls, there was the morning sun in the kitchen, instead of the noise of the machines, laughter and music. Michael returned to his notes about the sea, wrote more than before. He planned to go on another voyage, although I knew that now he would appreciate every minute on the shore even more. We met with friends, laughed until we cried, cooked dinner together. Our house was filled with life. I often found myself just standing there and looking at him, not believing that this was really happening. But it was reality. And each new day was a gift that we unwrapped together. That evening we sat on the balcony, watching the sunset. Michael held my hand, and his fingers were warm and strong. He hugged me as he had promised and whispered, "I have always loved you. Even when I could not say it, even when I seemed weak. You are my sea, my shore, and my home." I closed my eyes and leaned against him, feeling my heart beating steadily. We were silent, but in that silence there was everything, pain and struggle, losses and victories, tears and laughter. We had survived the storm, and now a new sea was opening before us, calm, bright, full of hope. And I knew, together we could overcome any waves. Because love is our greatest compass. And it always leads home.